Good. So this is physiology. Do what?
We have access to that power.
It should be on the canvas. This is, there was one with a black background. I didn't prep on that one. I didn't have that one in my file when I pulled it up, so that's not what I prepped on. This was more of an original one. We used to have Wes Todd come in. Wes Todd came in. He wanted to teach with us once a year so he could keep his hospital credentials current, so he could go visit procedures and keep his books up to date. And then last year he said, I'm done. I don't want to do it anymore. So look for the other one. This one's shorter. But if you really want to look at the other one, we can pull it up and I can make comments on it, but it won't be prepped. It'll be fresh. I'll see it as you see it. But I can do that. But this is what I prepped on, so. Okay, so this is a chapter about arteries, and a lot of it has to do with like the compliance of the vessel and how pressures get transmitted down an artery. And then the next one is the lymphatic system, which kind of, we can get into some interesting talks about hydrostatic and osmotic pressures and what keeps vascular volume in, or what wants to make it leave the vascular state. So there's really not as many concepts in these two chapters as many of our other chapters. So there's something, if you look at the way your left ventricle and your aorta work, your heart is kind of a double pump. And I've talked to you about this before in hemodynamics. I remember last quarter I talked about that. And so the LV generates pressure in systole, but then the aorta accepts volume and stretches depending on its compliance and releases that energy throughout diastole. And in the end game, what we end up with, instead of a pulsatile flow here at the ventricle, we end up with way downstream in the arterioles and capillaries, we end up with a steady flow. And the steady flow is what your tissues need for gas exchange and exchange of product. And there's something to describe how this works. It's called a Windkessel. And this was a water, these are three examples of different pumping systems. And this is right out of your book, yeah? Still have that picture? I think so. So I have a well on one of my houses, and it has a water pump. And you have water pumps in your engines of your car, and they basically are a rotary pump, and they generate a steady flow. And here's an example of pressure at 100 steady, no pulsing. And that's kind of what our machine pumps do. They're rotary pumps. Early pumps, back in the early days of firefighting, they had these big bellow systems, and they'd push. And these were some of the early pumps in the 1700s when they're wanting to move water, even back to the days of like the Arabian, early Egyptian and early Arabian. It wasn't really Egypt, but it was Arabian pumps. Anyway, they would be pushing and they'd have little gates. And then you end up with a pressure that rises and falls and rises and falls. And so you get these surges of flow, but that's not what our body really needs. So with this distendable bag on the outside of it, which is like our aorta, or the water pumps in the like 1900s. Did it go into this in the book when you read the chapter? My version of the book talks about these old 1903 water pumps, horse-drawn carriage and the water pumps for fire departments in New York City, no? Did you read it? Okay, we won't wait till you answer that. Some will say yes, some will say no. But they had this big rubber bellows, so you push this water pump, and then you get, instead of having water squirt, squirt, squirt when you're trying to put out a fire, you got this bellows that takes the energy like a big balloon and releases it, kind of like your aorta. Now you get a steady pressure. So that's it. That's called the Windkessel effect, is the ability to take this energy and store it and then release it. And if you wanted to push blood through a rigid tubing, it takes more energy. And then if you push blood through an elastic aorta, it takes less energy because you don't have to start. The inertia to start and stop this flow it takes energy. So it's better to keep it moving. Have you guys ever like been trying to push something big and heavy and you get it started? If you keep it moving, it's easier to keep it moving than to let it stop and start again. This is an interesting graph. This has to do more with compliance of the artery. How much stretch is there in that aorta? And that's a relationship. This is a formula for it. I won't make you do any math on that, but essentially it's change in volume divided by change in pressure. So if you have more compliance, you can take more volume with the same amount of pressure change. And look at these age groups. These are different age groups, and it shows the compliance of your aorta, and it's basically the elastin. It's called elastin. How much elastin do you have? And that wears out and degrades over time. And now you think about that. We're asking about how stretchy is your aorta, but you can also think about a young person versus an old person and look at their skin. How much oil, how elastic and soft is their skin? Young people have more supple skin. Older people, sometimes it's paper thin, looks a little brittle. So young people would have more compliant arteries. Older people have less compliant. So with the same rise in volume, they get a huge rise in pressure. So what that means is they have higher systolic pressures, higher pulse pressures. And we'll get into that here in a minute. Now this graph says, okay, here's reduced compliance with age equals a rise in pulse pressure. And then I look at this graph and it says, here's a 22-year-old and here's a 63-year-old. But this graph does not show what this headliner says. I think this could be a printing error. I put it up there. I did it. I put it up there, and the publishers put it in the book, but this graph does not show what this says. And it does not show what this says. Here's a big change in volume, small change in pressure. Small change in volume, big change in pressure. So that's saying it's not compliant. So compliance is how much does it stretch? Like when you blow a balloon up, they're real stretchy. They're compliant. I'm talking a kid's balloon for birthday. When we blow a balloon up for your arteries to push the plaque out of the way, our balloons are non-compliant. So they go to a certain size and stay that size so they don't tear the wall of the artery, so we can size the artery to the device we're trying to place, like a stent. But anyway, just wanted to let you know. I don't know if anybody noticed that. This graph says, yeah, when you get older, you have bigger pulse pressure. So what is pulse pressure? I've been talking about pulse pressure like everybody knows what it is. I hope you do. What is pulse pressure? I'll pause for an answer here. That's it. So Mario says it's the difference between systole and diastole. So it's an actual number. We don't have a grade on here, but let's say that was 50 and that's 100 and that's 150. Well, this is systole and this is diastole. So that's the pulse pressure. So that's maybe 75 millimeters of mercury pulse pressure for that patient in that status. Okay. So when you get older, you have less elastin, and this shows you that. Boy, that looks like a pretty elaborate formula. The elastic properties times 10 to the 5th to the newtons, maybe. I don't know what that is, so I shouldn't even have dove into that. I should have stayed away from that. Does anybody know what that formula is? It doesn't matter. We're not going to be calculating it. We're done with physics. We're just going to apply our knowledge of physics now. We're not going to do all the work. Anyway, here's something that's interesting. So here's a formula to figure out the mean pressure in the artery. That's too busy. There's too much going on there. I don't like that one. So there's a couple of different formulas, but I want to put one on the board for you guys. Let's say 150 over 75. Let's try that. So you have a systolic pressure of 150 and a diastolic pressure of 75. What's the mean pressure? The mean pressure equals systole plus 2 times diastole divided by 3. Because if you look at the timing of it, 1, 2, 3. These bars aren't exactly equal, but your body spends 1/3 of its time in systole, 2/3 of its time in diastole. So we weight diastolic pressure twice in the formula. Okay, that's how we come up with that S plus 2D. It's because of how much time you spend. So let's say this guy's 150, 75 times 2 is 150. So that if you add those up, that's 300. I picked a number that I could do in my head. 300 divided by 3 equals 100. So that might mean that this guy's mean pressure is 100. So you can kind of estimate what mean pressure would be just from looking at systole and diastole. Here's the pulse pressure, 120/80 on this guy, so he's 40 pulse pressure, and that's normal. And this is a graph that will show us what happens to your pulse pressure with increasing in stroke volume. So a bigger kick from your heart is going to make more pressure go out of there, and you're going to have a higher pulse pressure. And it's linear. As you double the volume, you'll double the pulse pressure. It's very linear response. So there's 3 variables for pulse pressure. 1 is stroke volume. 2 is afterload, the resistance in the peripheral vasculature. And 3 is the compliance of the artery. How much will it stretch? So this one is stroke volume. So if you push more volume, you get a higher pulse. That's not really hard to understand. That's true. Okay. And here's change in pressure with compliance and resistance. So this was stroke volume. Stroke volume's directly related. So if I increase the stroke volume, I increase my pulse pressure. If I decrease my compliance, I increase my pulse pressure. So when you get older, your pipes get stiffer. This graph shows it right, or this graph didn't show it right. This graph shows it right. As you get older, you have stiffer pipes because of reduced elasticity, you have increased pulse pressure. So elderly patients have higher systolic pressures. And then if you have higher resistance out in the back, at the back door, it hits the wall and you get, let's see what it says about that here. Well, we'll get into that here in a minute. Distal amplification. As you work your way down the periphery, the pressure waves will summate. And this is a good example. Here's the pressure at the aortic arch. It's 150/89. And as I move out the periphery towards your distal pulses, I have an accentuated systolic pressure and then a lower diastolic pressure. So this pressure wave summates because the pressure waves are bouncing off the walls of the vessels as you move out, and you get a summation, a systolic amplification. We will see that when we measure the femoral artery pressure from a sheath or the radial artery pressure from a sheath compared to when we get to the aorta in the cath lab, it'll be a lower systolic. The pressure has to, but the mean pressure, here's an important concept. The mean pressure has to be lower in the periphery or the flow wouldn't go there. Because the flow only goes downhill on a gradient, like a river goes downhill. If there's no gradient, it becomes a lake. There's no motion, there's no drop in elevation, there's no flow of water. So even though the systolic pressure is higher, the diastolic pressure is lower because the mean pressure drops off as you go farther and farther out the pipe. You guys remember, did you guys get into like voltage systems and Ohm's law when you got into physics? And you're measuring the voltage at different parts around the system and the volts drop as you get farther around it. There has to be a drop or there won't be a flow. Okay. So pretty clear with that. So you guys in the vascular lab, you vascular people, you guys will be studying all these pulses and you're looking at the secondary and tertiary waves as an indication of disease down there. But this is just a normal example of peripheral amplification. You guys want to make any comments about what you see in the waveforms downstream that let you know about pathology, you vascular or echo folks taking vascular classes?
First thing that goes is diastolic.
So when it say goes, what does that mean?
You see diastolic changes.
Do they drop?
Depends on the waveform.
Okay, so you guys are studying complex variations in the waveform to let you know about obstructed flow, yeah? We, we're more black and white in the cath lab. We squirt contrast in and take a picture of the artery, and we can see the profile of the artery, and if it's pinched down, we can also measure pressure drops. If you go past an obstruction, you'll lose pressure, just like on aortic stenosis, the LV pressure is high, aortic pressure is low. Same in an artery, downstream past stenosis. And then you guys in vascular are studying the pressure. You're studying the flow waves and pressure waves. Okay. This is something that is pretty much straightforward. You probably learned it in your EKG class when you took blood pressure, but there's a guy named Korotkov. I think it should be up on here somewhere. He figured out how to take blood pressure. You obstruct the artery with a cuff, so there's no flow, and then you start releasing that pressure. And as soon as the pressure comes through and exceeds the pressure in your cuff, it'll go downstream. And you start hearing a tapping sound. That's Korotkov sounds. Korotkov. And then, so systolic's always easy to listen to. Did you guys do that? Did you do cuff pressures and you learn how to take blood pressures? So that first sound's always real easy to hear. And then you keep dropping the cuff pressure until it goes below the diastolic pressure. And then you get more of a tone change. First, you start hearing tap, tap, tap here, and you know the systolic. But down here, you get a tone change. And it's a little bit more subtle to pick up. Did you guys have a little hard time with that at first, figuring out getting diastolics right? They're the harder one to hear. It's just a tone change. When I took the class, we had a nurse instructor, and we had a stethoscope with two headsets, and they came together in a Y to one bell or one diaphragm, and we would be listening. The bell is for low frequency, and the diaphragm is for high frequency. And so these are high frequency. Always put the Did you have a stethoscope with a little spin around, where it had like a little ceramic bell for low frequency, like heart murmurs, and then had a little like the surface of a drum, a high frequency diaphragm. Put that down for slips under the cuff better. And it's better for high frequency sounds. Anyway, well, we had this split thing. So I remember I could hear systolic, everybody could. And then she's like, okay, we're going to pay attention to this tone change. And when I hear it, I'm going to put my hand up. And then now I'm going to let you do it. When you hear it, you put your hand up. And it was a really good way for me to learn, because she was hearing the same thing I was hearing. And so we both kind of like zeroed in on that is the tone change, and you learn how to take diastolic pressure. Years later, I got into the pathology lab, and I was bored, so I would go around when you're in clinical or when you're working and there's no procedures going on. What are you going to do? You can bring your book and study? Yeah, maybe. Don't get on your phone and go surfing your internet stuff. Don't be doing that. They don't like that at the hospital. They don't like that work ethic. If you get on your phone, in fact, you don't even want to bring your phone to clinical, because they don't like you getting on your phone. You're distracted from what you're supposed to be doing. So what you do is you say, hey, I want to go down to Nuke Med and go see what they're doing, and maybe I'll check in once in a while, see if we get any more cases, or they can, page you if there's a case. But I went down to the laboratory pathology to see how they look at slides, to see when they're doing surgery to take cancer out. They keep cutting, and then they send the slides of pathology, and the pathologist looks at the tissue and says, you got all the cancer because everything around the boundary of your cut is normal tissue, and the cancer's on the inside of it. And he had the reason I brought the story up is because they had a microscope with two eye sets going down to one sample, so he could show me what I was seeing. And that's pretty interesting thing to learn from a pathologist. What does cancer look like? How do we know we surgically got it all? And not much to do with cardiology and putting in stents, but interesting medical information. Cancer is a big killer. So what I would say to you all is, when you're in clinical, if it's quiet and there's nothing going on, you can say, instead of say, well, I'll just go home, there's nothing going on, you can let me off early today. Go do something different. I used to go in the OR and get in there and help those guys get patients set up and help turn the room over. And they're like, what are you doing here? And I'm like, I'm just learning. I'm learning other things. I ended up getting a job offer in open heart surgery, because they said, we like your work ethic. You're in here doing stuff. You're not just sitting around in the lounge. So they offered to send me down to Houston to put me to perfusion school to be a pump tech for them, to run the heart-lung machine. Anyway, so, we got off subject a little bit, but that's Korotkov sound, systolic, diastolic, that's a little trickier. That's what we're doing. So really with chapter 6, arteries store energy in systole, release in diastole. It's a double pump. That's called the Wind-Kessel effect. Converts pulsatile to steady flow, and we need that down in the capillaries. As you get older, your compliance is reduced. It's harder to pump through stiff pipes. Pulse pressure here's where we go. Pulse pressure varies directly with stroke volume. So if I push more volume into your heart, into your vessel, I get more pulse pressure. And then indirectly with compliance. So if you get stiffer, you get bigger. So, well, when compliance drops, you get increased pulse pressure. So compliance dropping means they're getting stiffer. Make sense? Go ahead, Mario.
That's kind of a dumb question, but is high compliance mean it's able to stretch easier?
High compliance is real stretchy.
So wouldn't it be less work to pump it?
You know, let's see. Let's see. More work required with high compliance is very. Yeah, that doesn't make sense there, does it? Well, let's see. Maybe what does it say in your book in the summary? I didn't bring my book.
On our slide, it says more work required to pump with low compliance.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah, let's fix that. I think I agree with you on that. It makes more sense. Okay. We'll leave it like that. So that's an edit. And when I do edits for my students on calendars, well, you guys too, I do any edits, I'll make it red so it stands out. Thanks, Mario. Okay. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that resistance is also a variable related to pulse pressure. How are those related?
So high peripheral vascular resistance. So I did say that and it doesn't come up here. So let's figure it out. So if you have high peripheral vascular resistance, you have a lot of tense vessels, they're all tight. You have high blood pressure, you have a lot of resistance, a lot of afterload. Try to put something more into that, it's not going to give. So you're going to have increased pulse pressure with increased vascular resistance. Does that make sense? Yeah, I did bring that up earlier and I thought it would address it later, but it never did. It did in my reading last night, but it didn't make it to the slides. So the 3 things that affect pulse pressure, this right here says it indirectly with compliance, and we can also, oops. And indirectly with systemic vascular resistance. We'll leave it like that. So there's our slide. We modified it. Okay. So we'll move on. This is microcirculation. This is blood coming down an arterial, heading towards, these are the capillaries where gas exchange happens, oxygen, CO2, as well as change of nutrients, sugars and lipids, if you're in the gut or in the body and a muscle trying to deliver energy. There, let's say this is the arteriole, the capillaries, and then the venule, and then this is like a little one-way valve as you go back up here. But at any rate, well, there are valves as you get further up the veins. Let's say this is your hand. Let's call it your hand. And you put your hand in cold water. Your body doesn't want to cool your core temperature. So what it will do is it will open this meta-arteriole and let blood shunt through this meta-arteriole and go from the warm artery, not go out into the capillaries that are in that cold water and all that tissue that's cold. And this warm blood will sneak through here and get back to your core so you don't lose temperature. So this is like a non-nutritional flow. Did you ever hear that term, non-nutritional flow? When your blood went through the vascular system, but it never did its exchange, non-nutritional flow. That's a term I've heard before. And when you get into really cold water, that's one thing your body does, is it opens up these meta-arterioles. So they're like a shunt, a little built-in shunt. If you're, you just ate a big meal, and this is what grandma always told you not to do, go out and start running and exercising after you ate a big meal, all your superior mesenteric artery and all those vessels in your gut are open and they're just they're just digesting and they're putting blood into all your rugae, your stomach and your small intestines doing all its thing. And large intestine is going to pick up the water later on. When you start exercising, and that blood needs to go to your muscles, not to your gut. And then grandma says, don't do that because, you'll vomit or you'll inhale, what did grandma always say? Why can't you go running after you eat? My grandma used to tell me this. It's like, it was a physiological thing. But the problem was, it made your gut say, I got to shunt my flow away from my food and I got to take it to the muscles. So it would open the meta-arterials in all your GI tracts. Those little guys would open up. And now you got all that food sitting there and it can't get digested. And it's like they worry you vomit or you get sick to your stomach if you exercise after you eat. It never happened to me. Did it happen to any of you? Did you ever, you did? You ran so hard after you ate that you had to, tell us your story.
Yeah, I have about a 2-hour window after eating. I can't do anything crazy.
Your body needs 2 hours to digest?
Like if I go on any heavy workout, I'll just throw it all out.
Really? Okay.
I did not find it was a nasty the first time I found it out.
Yeah. Did your grandma tell you about that or did you just learn that on your own?
No, this is a hard lesson I learned.
You just learned it on your own. Okay. But anyway, so this is microcirculation and non-nutritional flow meta-arterial, something maybe we hadn't heard of before. Okay, here's a hamster cheek, and they show us giving them epinephrine, and these little meta-arterials close down. Okay. This is an interesting law of physics, and it relates to like big vessels and small vessels. It relates to all vessels, but it talks about how much stress is in the wall of the vessel. It's called Laplace's law of wall tension, and the tension equals the pressure times the radius. So if you have an aorta and it's under 100 millimeters of mercury of pressure, there's a large radius. So, 100 times a large radius puts a lot of tension. Now, if you take that same 100 millimeters and put it in a capillary, it's like hundreds of times smaller than the aorta. So it's pressure, the tension on the wall, not the pressure, not millimeters of mercury, but the tension on the wall is hundreds of times less because of its small radius. And that explains why the aorta needs to be really thick and the endothelium can be down to 1 cell layer thick but not rupture because of Laplace's law. Where it becomes an issue for us is if you are, can you guys see me if I write on the board? Yeah, I see myself there. If we have, this is the distal aorta and there's the left and right iliacs. If we have an aneurysm that doubles the diameter of the aorta, then we end up having twice as much tension on that wall. And if you have twice as much tension, it's going to want to stretch it more. So it's kind of a nasty recirculating feedback loop of leading to disaster when you have an aneurysm. If the wall is bigger, there's more tension. The more tension, the more it stretches. The more it stretches, the more tension. The more tension, the more it stretches. So we track aortas when they get to be about, what is it, guys, in vascular? About 6 centimeters. That's when they blow.
5 and 6.
No, 5 is danger. 6 is red line. So you guys will be tracking aortic aneurysms. And I already told you the story, I think, in another class about my mom's husband and how he had the aneurysm and he didn't want to get it treated because he didn't feel it. You don't feel them. Because I feel fine. Or you're not fine, it's going to blow. And so this is an example where Laplace's law becomes an issue in our body with aneurysms. Questions about any of that? You guys will track it over and over and keep measuring this. They can do CTs with contrast. They can do CTs and measure the diameter of the aorta. Eventually what we'll do is go in and put endograft in there. And it's got a metallic frame, but it's got, if you looked at it end on, it's got the metal and it's got a sleeve, like a little mylar sleeve or a Kevlar sleeve, so that the blood goes through here and it does not pressurize the walls of the aneurysm. And then eventually this just clots off. I think I talked about this in another chapter. Maybe it was hemodynamics. But that's an endo graft. We put those in the cath lab. Go up one leg, put it in. You guys in vascular will be studying these pockets to make sure there's no swirling or Doppler flow back in there, meaning it's still under pressure and there's active blood flowing through there. We don't want that. Occasionally, somebody will develop a little collateral or a little blood vessel will feed back here and repressurize the sac. So then we go in and if it's a little tiny artery, we go in and put a little embolic coil in it to seal it off because we don't want that aortic sac pressurized. So that's the follow-up work. My mom's husband is now a year out. He's had his follow-ups. His graft is stable. He has no sac flow and no pressurized, no collaterals have developed, but they'll still have follow-ups. Here's a look at the endothelium. It's one layer thick where there's an exchange. There's some smooth muscle to control flow, but not much on endothelium. And it produces, the body produces chemicals to cause vasodilation. And one of those is, here they all are, prostacyclin, acetylcholine, endothelial derived relaxation factor, and then nitric oxide, which is a substrate of nitroglycerin. This is produced at the cellular level and it causes vasodilation to relax and let flow go through. So these are all vasodilators. Endothelium is supposed to be smooth and glossy. When we start getting lipids and plaques built up, we start getting the depositions underneath these layers, and then they don't contract smoothly. Here's a capillary cross section. It's capillaries down at the small exchange level. There's this whole talk in the book about diffusion and filtration. Filtration and diffusion happen with like oxygen and CO2. They're lipid soluble. They just go right across. There's flow limited, meaning if you have low flow through the vessel, there's low exchange. And then there's diffusion limited, where it has to do with gradients on both sides of the boundaries. Don't get too hung up on that. Then what if we have a really large molecule, like a big molecule that needs to cross the capillaries? We have these things called pinocytotic vesicles. They're like little gateway doors that can help transport large molecules that could not slip. They couldn't slip through the cracks here, and they couldn't just diffuse through the fluid of the cell, but they're like little gateways between these cells. Those are called pinocytotic vesicles, and they can slip. If things can't get between these gap junctions, which is this, then this is a transport mechanism, like a little transport. Pinocytotic vesicles. Cross sections of a capillary. I don't have much to say about that. This is interesting. So now we'll move to something that's clinical, practical application to all this information relating to the lymphatic system. Well, this is still dealing with the blood vessel right here, and then here's your lymphs. We'll talk about those in a minute. There's two opposing forces in your blood. That one wants to push fluid out of your vascular system, and one wants to hold fluid in. Now we need the fluid to be in our vascular system. We need gas exchange and exchange of cross current of sugars and lipids and other metabolites, but we basically need the fluid to stay in the vessel. But when there's blood pressure in a vessel, which is called hydrostatic pressure, it tends to want to push things out through these little gaps because they are permeable. Your endothelium is permeable. And over the period of a day, here's something interesting. Over the period of one day, 24 hours, all of your vascular volume will have left your vascular space and goes out into the interstitial fluids. Then your lymph system picks it up, collects it, and brings it back into your vascular system in this little connection called the thoracic duct up high in your chest. So all this fluid leaks out of your vessels, and then it's out in the tissues, the interstitial tissues, like edema tissues, and then it gets picked up by the lymph. The lymph doesn't have a pump. There's no pump on your lymph system. So it relies on one-way valves and muscular contraction. So when you start walking, your lymph system gets pumped and it moves the blood, or moves the lymph, which is clear fluid, moves it up towards your thoracic duct. Okay, so the hydrostatic pressure wants to make it leave. The lymph system moves all of your vascular volume in 24 hours back from the tissue back in and brings it back into the vascular space. So that's what wants to push stuff out. Now, what helps hold it in is the oncotic, or also known as osmotic pressure. And it's also, I've heard of it called the colloidal pressure. Colloidal pressure, osmotic, oncotic pressure. This is having to do with the density of the tissue, of the substances in your blood, and plasma proteins like albumin. So if you have a lot of albumin, a lot of plasma proteins, that helps keep your vascular system from losing volume. Where if you have high blood pressure, you're losing volume. You have high osmotic pressure, you're holding on to volume. Osmotic, oncotic are the same thing. Here's something that happens to patients when they get into a major, somebody have a question? Okay, thought I heard something. You get into a major motor vehicle accident. You get into some major trauma. Then you have what's called capillary leak syndrome. Have you guys ever heard of that? People get this, their body gets really traumatized, and all the pores, all their little gap junction in the endothelium become more porous, and they lose more volume out into the tissue. So with no change in hydrostatic pressure to push it out and no osmotic change, they get into a major accident and they start losing fluid. They're leaking fluid. So now they're hypovolemic, low volume in their body. And so we have to give these patients albumin. We give them this plasma protein called albumin. And we also give it to burn victims. If you have a bad burn, your body can be traumatized where you start losing volume. Capillary leak syndrome, you can die, you become hypovolemic. All your fluid from your vascular system ends up in your tissue all over your body, and there's nothing left for your heart to pump. So we give albumin. Not so much in cardiology, you know, we're not giving albumin because they're traumatized by a heart attack. That's more like metabolic management of patients. You'll see that on med-surg floor after big surgeries or big traumas or burn victims, they'll be given albumin. That's to manage their osmotic pressure to help hold volume in. Okay, you'll hear about it in your careers, and now you know what it is. So capillary flow is regulated by contractile state of the arterioles. Capillaries can withstand high transmural pressures because they're really small radius. That's Laplace's law. Endothelium produces this relaxation factor to regulate flow through the capillaries. And then here's talks about how things can transmit across the capillary. There's diffusion, where if you have high concentration on one side of a boundary and low on the other, they want to naturally balance out. So the diffusion will go from high to low concentration. Sometimes that's limited if you have low flow, that there's not as much flow going on. Medium particles are harder to move across because they're just harder to get through those gaps. And if they're really large particles, they use these little pinocytotic vesicles to move large products through the capillaries. And then hydrostatic forces, they work to expel volume from your capillary. That's your blood pressure. Oncotic versus, also known AKA as osmotic pressures, work to retain volume, and that's your plasma protein level, and that's the albumin I was just talking about it. And then your lymphatic system runs next to your vessels, utilizes muscular contraction to move flow. And what else does the lymph system do besides bring the volume back? Have you ever had, you're sick and then you get the really tender lymph nodes under your neck and under your armpit? It also filters out foreign substances, bacteria, debris. So it's also, the lymph nodes are filters. That's part of your lymph system. So, yeah. And then it's the thoracic duct. I actually, one time I had shot a deer, and I was not in a predator environment, because when you shoot a deer, if you're way out in the woods and there's a lot of bears around, they hear that gunshot and that to them is the dinner bell. They'll come running in and steal they'll try to scare you off the thing that you killed and take it from you. And hunters have been killed in Montana because grizzlies come in and they kill them. You got the food, I want it, I'm killing you, and I'm taking your deer. So for me, I was in a non-predatory environment, so that's important. You don't want to be like fooling around with your head in the pile of blood with nobody to back you up. So, but I was looking at I was pulling out all the thoracic and the pelvic and abdominal cavity products, which is called field dressing to make it lighter so you can haul it back to your truck. But I could find the aorta. It's real rubbery. I found that along the spine. And then I was working my way up to the subclavian, way up here in the chest, and I found the thoracic, I found the lymph system. And it was like really flat. The aorta is like this big on a deer and rubbery, like a rubber pipe, white rubbery pipe. Veins are a little thinner, but they have a little bit of structure to them. The lymph duct was like almost gossamer, kind of like the noodles you might get at a nice Japanese restaurant. They're really soft and they're translucent. You kind of see through them. That's what it looked like. And excuse me. And so I opened it up, and the fluid that came out was white and milky, kind of milky and slippery. And that was the lymph fluid. So I found it, and I was pretty excited about that. And I thought, oh, that's pretty. And I looked around, I'm all about no bears. Okay, we're okay. I can go ahead and get rid of this thing and get it back to my truck. What else do we do with do you guys do anything with the lymph system and vascular? Are you guys doing any study with that? Is there any involvement? Does that come into play clinically for you guys? I don't know of it.
We haven't yet.
Yeah, I don't know if you will. I don't know. We don't do anything with the lymph system and the cardiovasculars. We don't like to cannulate it. We don't try to take a picture of it. My father, he had cancer when he was a young man, testicular cancer, when he was after he had his 3 children. And they did a lymph angiogram. They cut down and then they injected dye into his lymph, and they watched. It's really slow flowing, so they had to wait like an hour or two, but they watched to see where it flowed. They were trying to see if there's cancer, where the cancer was going in his body. So they were tracking his lymph flow in oncology, but it was not like an angiogram where we take a picture and 3 seconds later it's there, it moved, you see it? This was like hours. It was really slow. Anyway, that's the only application I've seen where they had to do an imaging of it was before I was old enough to know about it, but my father told me about it. So that's the end of that. And that's done early, which is good. So just arterial system, pay attention to stroke volumes and pulse pressures and compliance. And lymph system, pay attention to osmotic and oncotic versus hydrostatic pressures and managing fluid volume. And how does the lymph system work? Anything else? I think that's about it. So I have already written the test. It's 20 questions. I'm starting to dig on those true false. So you guys get a lot of those. They're real easy to write. Yeah, I'll be honest. I got to write all these tests this quarter, yeah. But true false, so don't outsmart yourself. Don't get yourself all flipped on the other side of the coin. Read the question and pay attention to what it says, and does that seem true on the first read? If it does, it's probably true. If something's off with that, it's probably false, so then investigate. Yeah. After this, the next chapter we get into is peripheral vascular. And this one is one where I'm going to deviate from the book, and I'm going to have you study the map of all the major arteries in the body. We're not going to get into the gut. We're going to do arms, head, legs. We're not going to do all the gut. I'm just skipping that because we don't need to do everything. But you're going to learn to name the arteries from the heart all the way out to your hand, and from your pelvis all the way down to your toes. And then all the 4 vessels of the brain, we're going to learn all of those, the vertebrals and the carotids. So we're going to get into that. That's a deviation from the book. But I thought it would be good to just to learn the arterial roadmap. That's the highway we work on. And for you vascular and echo guys, you're like, yeah, we already learned that in another class. So that's gonna be real easy for you. That'll be like half the test is gonna be arterial. You know, what artery is this? And you'll obviously have a picture and you'll match them up. And then the other part of that chapter is having to do with vascular volume, cardiac and vascular function curves. Well, how does the body move volume around? So we'll get into that next week. Anything else? So for the invasive guys, I have a 12:30 class with you guys. We're going to get into fractional flow reserve and coronary anatomy some more.